pre-dawn air has a unique weight to it, heavier and cooler than the midday heat you will eventually know. You do not wake suddenly, but rather as if your consciousness drifts back into focus over several long, slow minutes, like breath returning to an emptied chamber. The immediate sounds are close at hand. The low, guttural rumble of human movement on stone, punctuated by the occasional creaking sigh of poorly oiled wood. It is a quiet soundscape, a symphony composed entirely of effort and dampness. You slowly become aware of your body's position in the sleeping niche. The straw mattress beneath you holds the accumulated chill of the night, pressing upward against your back through the thin layers of tunic. You stretch slightly, noticing how the small pop in your spine feels oddly satisfying after hours of stillness. It is a simple ache, utterly ordinary, yet it signals the readiness of muscle and sinew for the work ahead. The first sensory input to truly pierce the lingering fog of sleep is the smell. It is a complex blend that defines this particular corner of the city at this hour. Damp earth, the faint metallic tang of wood smoke already settling from nearby hearths, and something sharper, cleaner, the scent of communal washing. You can pinpoint where the water comes from. It must be drawn near enough to sustain such routine ablutions before the city fully awakens. This odor is profoundly familiar, grounding you in the specific geography of your life. You sit up slowly, moving with a careful deliberation that seems to defy gravity and fatigue. Your movements are not for speed, but for economy. Every gesture must conserve energy until the wheel spins. You wrap yourself loosely in a woolen cloak draped over the back of your simple cot, a necessary measure against the persistent chill clinging to the stone walls. There is a ritualistic aspect to these first minutes, a quiet preparation that seems as essential as mixing the clay itself. You rise and head toward the small basin tucked into the corner alcove. The water here is cool, shockingly cold, almost painfully so, a clear, grayish volume carried in an earthenware amphora. You cup your hands, feeling the minute temperature difference between the bowl's surface and the curve of your palms. This simple act connects you to the resource that defines both your survival and your craft. You begin the washing ritual slowly, not merely cleaning, but a reorientation of self. Your fingers trace over the roughness of the basin's rim. Years of accumulated mineral deposits have given it a muted patina. You rub soap, likely made from lye derived from burnt fats, into your skin until the film of dirt and residue lifts away, leaving behind that clean, faintly alkaline scent. As you wash your forearms and hands, you are acutely aware of their texture: calloused pads, slightly stained knuckles, tendons taut beneath the winter-hardened skin. These hands are not merely your own, they are extensions of the craft, tools perfected by necessity. Before moving on to the main labor, you pause near the threshold that marks the boundary between your domestic space and the wet public thoroughfare. Here, the light is minimal, diffused through the gaps in woven shades, or perhaps simply the low-hanging, grimy dawn sky. The cobblestones outside look slick with residual moisture, reflecting the grayish glow like a scattered mirror. You observe these stones, the thousands of hands that have trod upon them, carrying everything from buckets of fresh water to fragile mounds of freshly shaped pottery. They bear the accumulated weight of routine. You smooth down your apron, made of coarse linen, and take a final moment, simply breathing. The air here feels substantial, breathable, almost chewable in its coolness. It carries the distant whisper of the city waking. A dog's quick bark echoes off stone walls. The rhythmic squeal of an unseen cartwheel drags across the tessellated paving, the hiss of steam rising from some cooking brazier. These sounds do not suggest chaos, but rather the predictable emergence of order, the essential machinery of urban life starting up. The shift in atmosphere feels palpable as you move toward your main workshop area. Here, the scent changes again, taking on a deeper note, damp peat mixed with wet silt and mineral salts. This is the smell of raw creation, the perfume of unformed earth. You approach the designated space where the day's materials await, perhaps stored beneath a lean-to roof or within a partially enclosed courtyard. You kneel down near the edge of the small, contained area reserved for wet work. The floor here seems perpetually damp, coated in a fine, reddish dust that is always slightly tacky. This residue tells a story of countless hours, discarded slip, spilled water, and millennia-old mineral seepage. You reach out your hand, letting your fingers brush against the compacted earth. It yields subtly beneath your touch, cool to the skin, but with an underlying resilience. This initial preparation is not about making anything. It is about readiness. It is a quiet acknowledgement of the immense patience required, the time needed before true labor can begin. The raw materials demand respect, and that respect starts in these muted pre-dawn hours when the rest of the city is still encased in its necessary slumber. The air, still cool from the night, and carrying the faint memory of wood smoke, shifts as you move away from the sheltered confines of your dwelling. You walk with a deliberate slowness, allowing your eyes to adjust not just to the nascent morning light, but to the familiar contours of this working city. Your destination lies beyond the residential clusters, where the cobblestones begin to give way to rougher, uneven ground, the edge that separates organized habitation from necessary resource gathering. The silence here is different from the deep hush within your home. It is a pregnant quiet, filled with the potential sounds of industry waiting to awaken. The walk itself is an education in pace. You notice the subtle variations in the paving stones beneath your sandals, some smooth and worn by countless feet, others rough-hewn and sharp, telling stories of cartwheels and hurried steps across decades. Every step feels weighted with purpose as you draw nearer to the riverbank. The transition from the dry, dusty smell of baked clay to the rich, loamy dampness near the water's edge is immediate and profound. You slow your pace further, breathing deeply. This shift in scent, the mingling of minerals, wet silt, and vegetable decay, is the specific perfume of creation. Reaching the bank, you pause momentarily, letting your senses catalog the scene. The river itself moves with a steady, muffled rhythm. It is not the roar of rapids, but the deep, insistent sigh of current against an established bed. Looking down, you see the water reflecting the pale, bruised colors of the rising sky, a mix of grays and muted rose that hasn't quite committed to dawn. The natural world here seems immensely patient compared to the hurried rhythms of your neighbors in the city center. You feel the grit beneath your feet as you step onto the bank where the earth slumps down toward the current. This ground, saturated by the river, is what holds the secret material you need. Kneeling down now feels like a natural extension of your body, settling you into the immediate plane of the task. You begin to search through the damp debris lining the bank, the mix of fallen leaves, bits of washed up wood, and fine sediment. Your focus narrows intensely onto the soil itself. This is not mere dirt. It is a complex matrix, holding potential energy, waiting for your specialized knowledge to unlock its utility. You observe how some patches are dark black from organic decay, others streaked with the lighter color of mineral deposition. You start by sweeping aside the superficial debris, carefully hand sorting through the layers. Your fingers become incredibly attuned to the feel of the material. You learn immediately that simply scooping up wet mud will yield a heterogeneous mess, too much random gravel, too little cohesive body. What you are seeking is uniformity, a yielding paste. This requires patience and discrimination, skills almost as valuable as the ability to spin the wheel itself. Periodically, you lift handfuls of soil, allowing them to drain slowly between your fingers. You test it for its plasticity, pressing the damp material together and observing how easily it reforms, how resistant it is to falling apart. A good clay body has a certain memory. It holds its shape temporarily before finally giving way, demonstrating both resilience and pliability. If you press too hard, it tears coarsely. If you press too softly, it flakes away into useless dust. Your goal becomes isolating the finest silts, the pale, uniform particles that promise an even surface when fired. These are mixed with the coarser elements, which act as temper. You recall the necessity of tempering, understanding implicitly that pure river mud, while beautiful in its potential sheen, would be too unpredictable. It could shrink unevenly or crack when subjected to the violent heat of the kiln. You look for gravels that have been naturally smoothed by years of water action. These are ideal inclusions. You gather a handful, feeling the subtle difference between rounded river stones and jagged pieces of broken brickwork. The curved fragments offer structural stability. They act as microscopic scaffolding within the resulting vessel wall, keeping the entire form from succumbing to thermal shock. The initial mixing on the bank is instinctive, yet disciplined. You scoop up patches of darker, more organic earth, which provide necessary binding strength. Then mix them gently with the lighter, finer kaolin silt you prize so highly. You are not stirring aggressively, rather, you are blending, coaxing the disparate parts into a cohesive unit. The resulting mass feels cool and weighty in your lap, dark gray where it is wettest, transitioning to mottled earth tones as it dries slightly in the weak rising light. As you work through the material, a quiet rhythm begins to emerge, the methodical scraping of the trowel against the damp ground, the rhythmic splash as excess water washes away into the river, and the gentle thud of accumulated material being piled into a manageable mound. This process is profoundly physical, engaging the lower back, the shoulders, and the deepest concentration in your hands. The accumulated clay is now quite substantial, a mix that smells intensely of wet minerals and fresh silt, a potent, earthy scent that belongs nowhere else but to this specific corner of the riverbank. You notice how the morning dew has settled on the coarser grains within the pile, making them glimmer briefly before being coated again by the moisture content of the clay itself. The texture is remarkable, simultaneously yielding enough to be molded and firm enough to retain a substantial form. It is here, in this quiet gathering of necessity, that you contemplate the relationship between environment and endeavor. The river provides the raw ingredient, the earth dictates the basic properties. Your skill, your knowledge, that is what transforms a random collection of wet sludge into usable matter, capable of holding oil, water, or sustenance for an entire family. You realize that great architectural feats require foundational materials just as much as they require skilled masons. The longevity of Rome itself rests, in part, on the simple durability of containers like these. You perform a final check on your mound, ensuring that no large, unpredictable chunks of random stone remain too close to the surface layer. You need a pliable consistency, right down to the core. You use your palms and forearms to knead the outer layers gently, improving the homogeneity. This kneading is not for strength. It is an act of spiritual cleansing of the material, settling its atoms into agreement. The effort stills you, demanding total presence in the immediate tactile exchange between hand and mud. With a deep sigh that carries the satisfaction of honest physical labor, you finally turn your attention away from the gathered heap of earth. Your task here is complete. The raw components are secured. You carry the material or arrange it for later transport back to the workshop by cart or by human effort, feeling the weight, not just in physical terms, but in the weight of purpose. This newly unified mass, this rich dark composite, represents hours of labor and the unique mineral bounty of the region, ready now to transition into the highly controlled mechanical process awaiting you at your wheel. You settle onto the wooden bench beside the wheel, a rhythm already established in your body. It is not merely an object you sit near. It is an extension of your own endurance, worn smooth by decades of damp clay and focused effort. The air in the workshop remains cool, carrying the mixed scent of wet silt, stored straw temper, and the faint, underlying tang of last night's wood smoke that has not yet fully dissipated. Before you, the heavy wooden wheel waits, its face dark and polished, marked by countless arcs of damp earth. You pick up a lump of clay, the rich, gray-brown composite gathered from the riverbank, and let it rest in your palm. It is cool and slightly yielding under your thumb, holding the memory of the river's current. The weight feels correct, substantial enough to resist impatient force, but soft enough to respond to measured pressure. You begin by centering the lump. You knead it gently, applying consistent circumferential pressure across your palms until it settles into a compact dome. This initial process is more about self-calibration than preparation for work. You are gathering the focus of the entire morning's activity back into this single, manageable mass. Your thumbs press against the center, pushing outwards just enough to build internal tension without rupture. The clay resists at first, feeling slightly grainy, requiring an increase in your own deliberate effort. You turn the lump slowly, allowing gravity and muscle memory to guide its settling form. The wheel is heavy, designed for the patient worker, not the hurried one. When you begin to set it spinning, a hand crank turning the thick wooden beam, the motion is slow, methodical, an almost labored breath into the morning silence. A low, thrumming sound begins, a steady, resonant whisper that seems to emanate from deep within the workshop floor and into your own bones. You allow the momentum to build slowly, matching its pace with the rhythmic flexing of your forearms. As the wheel reaches a patient, even speed, you place your hands on the damp dome of clay. The shift in texture is immediate. The resistance becomes slicker, less granular, and profoundly responsive. This is where the craft transcends mere labor. It becomes an intimate conversation between your will and the earth. You are not fighting the material, you are persuading it to obey a gentle geometry. Your fingers spread out, feeling the cool humidity rise from the clay's surface, drawing in the surrounding air. You begin by drawing the center mass down toward the wheel's plane. This initial action requires immense steady pressure, using your forearms as levers and your palms as supports. You must visualize the form, a column rising from the earth, and translate that abstraction into physical force. The clay yields with a wet sigh against the damp surface of the wheelhead. There is no rush here, only the patience to let tension build, and then release it with controlled intention. The sound changes as you begin to draw up the walls. It shifts from a dull thud of earth being manipulated to a smoother, higher whispering slip sound, like wet silk dragged across stone. You feel the precise moment when the clay achieves a temporary, perfect state of plasticity, enough water content to flow and smooth easily, yet enough cohesive structure to hold the memory of your shaping hands without collapsing under its own weight. This subtle balance is what defines the expertise you carry. You contemplate the required curvature. If you are making a storage jar for olive oil, the shoulders must be wide and robust, bearing the strain of repeated handling. If it is an atrium lamp, the walls require a delicate, tapering grace to catch the faint light of dawn later in the day. The form dictates the necessary pressure points. You adjust your grip slightly, changing which fingers guide the upward lift, transferring minute amounts of varying force around the circumference. The physical effort is strangely calming, drawing out the tension stored elsewhere in your body, in your shoulders, your neck, the small knots behind your knees. Each successful coil, each gentle expansion of the curve feels like a quiet accomplishment against the day's slow unfolding. You notice how the steam created by the friction between your hands and the wet clay rises quickly, momentarily fogging the air in front of you before dissipating into the general workshop humidity. It requires an intense focus on minute detail. When shaping the base of a water basin, for instance, you must work around the fulcrum point, the unseen circle where the jar meets the wheel, with exquisite delicacy, ensuring that no weak seam or uneven thickness will cause it to fail when dry and brittle later. You are constantly checking for weaknesses in the material itself, looking for minute fissures or patches of improperly mixed clay that would betray the entire piece. Sometimes, your fingers brush against a forgotten remnant on the bench, a scrap of highly figured, beautifully fired terracotta from an earlier piece, perhaps slightly cracked, but undeniably elegant. You pause momentarily, tracing the ridges and curves with your fingertip. These pieces represent both the pinnacle of skill and the humbling reality of material failure. Every perfect curve is flanked by ghosts of things that did not survive to this moment. It is a quiet lesson in resilience. You continue drawing up the walls, guiding the profile upward until you reach a predetermined neck or lip. The wrist movements become almost balletic in their precision, a series of controlled inclines and declines, steadily lifting material while thinning it into an even, consistent plane. You are molding not just wet earth, but the very function of Roman life, the ability to store oil, to hold fresh water, to burn scented lamps that dispel the damp night air. The deep satisfaction is found in the slip running off your hands, a slow, milky trickle of purified clay residue that seems almost sacred. It represents transformation, the wild earth submitting its raw form to human artistry and necessary utility. You scrape this excess from your fingers with a worn piece of wood, watching the gray slurry bead up before dripping into a shallow puddle at the edge of the bench. Finally, you stop. The wheel slows until it settles completely, leaving only a gentle reverberation in the air. Before you rests the completed vessel, a large oil storage jar, perhaps. It has achieved its intended geometry: broad mouth, sturdy belly, tapered neck. You lift your hands away slowly, flexing your fingers against the slightly tacky residue that remains. The effort of shaping the clay is exhausting in a specific way. It leaves a deep, comfortable ache in the core muscles, a soreness that signifies purposeful action. The wet piece now requires immediate attention for final trimming and removal from the wheelhead. You spend the next few minutes delicately scraping away any material built up on the inside curvature or unevenly layered at the base. The shavings fall quietly onto the dirt floor, little discarded moments of perfect potential. These scraps will be recycled back into the slip, enriching the clay's content for the subsequent piece. You arrange the finished jar carefully upon a broad pallet, setting it gently amongst dozens of other wet-wares lamps awaiting their slender bodies. Small bowls destined for bread and dip, deep basins meant for bathing ritual. They are grouped by type and readiness, an organized testament to the methodical passage of time. You survey the neat stacks of damp potential, knowing that all this careful shaping is merely the beginning. The true test of these forms has not yet come. It lies in the slow breath of drying air, waiting for the heat of the sun, or the patient management of your ongoing care. The cool dampness of the workshop air clings to your tunic, a familiar chill that seems woven into the very stone and wood. You lean against the workbench, letting your fingers rest on the smooth, slightly rough surface where countless bowls and lamps have been shaped in the weeks before. The sun is climbing now, casting long, pale stripes through the narrow opening above the stall, illuminating motes of dust suspended in the air, a slow, visible meditation on time passing. You do not move quickly. Every adjustment feels weighted with the day's cumulative labor. Your attention drifts over the drying racks, a silent inventory of potential utility. Here, stacked carefully by the dampening material and type of clay body, are the forms you have coaxed into existence. Small bowls destined for fruit, shallow basins intended to hold washing water, and the elegant, narrow necks of oil lamps meant for an atrium's quiet corner. You trace a fingertip over the lip of a wide storage jar. It feels cool beneath your touch, porous in places that still retain the scent of wet earth mixed with last night's smoke. You consider its function. It must hold grain or olive oil, something essential and sustaining. The weight suggested by its sturdy curve is comforting, a reliable container for life's necessities. Roman existence, at its most fundamental level, relied on such enduring vessels. The forms themselves tell stories of routine. Observe the lamp. Its narrow mouth suggests it was meant to be placed in an alcove, casting light only on those gathered close, a contained circle of warmth against the sprawling anonymity of the city night. Contrast this with the basin. Its wide, shallow scoop implies communal action, washing hands at dawn or mixing mortar for repair. Each slight variation in curvature, each degree of lip thickness, dictates its use, and therefore its place within the daily rhythms of a household. You move along the racks, your gaze lingering on groupings that share similar intent. There are several identical oil jars, designed to fit together neatly upon a single shelf, implying a standardized domestic unit, a predictable, reliable routine in which the vessel plays an unassuming but crucial role. You think about the hands of those who will eventually use these items, the baker kneading his dough, the matron washing clean linens, the citizen lighting a lamp on a dark evening. Their lives are framed and supported by your labor. It is a quiet philosophy that keeps you at work. The sheer necessity of this trade roots you deeply in the lifeblood of the city. You are not making art, you are manufacturing infrastructure. These vessels contain light, they hold sustenance, they manage water, they facilitate the simple, complex mechanism of living together under the canopy of an empire. The geometry is fascinating. Look at how gravity has dictated every curve and angle. A storage jar must have a sturdy base to withstand uneven flagstones. A drinking cup needs sufficient interior strength so that liquid does not weaken its structural integrity. The materials guide the design, just as human need dictates the material's final shape. There are no frivolous curves here, nothing merely decorative. Every slight swell or calculated taper serves a physical purpose. You pick up a sample of slip, the fine, watery mixture used to strengthen the clay body before firing. It clings delicately to your fingers, smelling faintly mineral and sweet, like wet river stones baking in the morning sun. You press it against your thumb, feeling its consistency, enough viscosity to fill gaps and stabilize fragile seams, but thin enough not to distort the form when spread thinly. This physical action of strengthening is an early lesson in enduring function. The clay you gather from the earth is raw potential. The slip is the chemical promise that allows that potential to hold together under tremendous heat. It represents the binding elements, the little things, unseen or unappreciated, that make a whole structure possible. You shift your focus to the stacks of semi-dried pieces. They are heavy enough now that they no longer seem like mere forms, but solid commitments. You feel the texture radiating from them, a delicate warmth, neither fully cold nor truly hot, marking their passage through evaporation and curing. Dust motes dance around them, illuminated by the growing daylight, seeming almost to breathe with the slow process of dehydration. The careful placement is paramount now. A piece must not touch another that has dried at an entirely different rate. Differential shrinkage creates weakness, a stress fracture waiting for the kiln's breath to reveal it. You mentally diagram the entire structure of the drying area. Which pieces need support from porous straw, which are spaced slightly apart in direct airflow, and which might require temporary shielding if the midday sun proves too intense. The organization becomes a ritual in itself. You work systematically, moving from the largest, most durable wares, the heavy amphorae designed for bulk transport, the large cistern basins, to the smaller, more delicate items like cosmetic jars or individual drinking cups. As you stack these, you notice how slight variations exist even among items intended to be identical. One jar might have a slightly uneven neck. Another basin might exhibit a minute irregularity in its base ring. These flaws are not merely mistakes. They are historical fingerprints, reminders of the human element embedded within the industrial process. Each pot carries the signature of the artisan who breathed life into the wet earth, shaping it with intention and muscle memory. This is where your reflection settles. Every day, you perform a necessary mediation between fleeting raw material and enduring domestic use. The dampness gives way to the hard permanence of fired terracotta, translating transience into utility. You are managing not only clay, but also expectation, the silent promise that when those lamps glow tonight, or when those oil jars are filled with precious liquid, your labor will have been successfully integrated into the quiet, continuous narrative of urban survival. You gather a handful of dried, fibrous timber, little fragments of burnt wood and crushed brick. These aggregates were added to make the clay resistant to thermal shock, giving it the necessary robustness to withstand the extreme heat you are about to subject it to. They speak of endurance, surviving fire by virtue of being broken down in a controlled way. The rhythm of this chapter is one of respectful appreciation for structure and function. The city moves because vessels hold its elements: oil, water, stored food. Your pottery does not merely accompany the life, it structurally supports its mundane rhythm. You take a final sweep over the drying racks, noting any area where humidity might be pooling or airflow impeded. Everything must be prepared for the next stage, the fiery baptism that will transform wet earth back into stable, enduring material, completing the circle of necessity and skilled craft. The wheel has finally stilled, the damp weight of the last basin resting gently in a neat stack. You feel the familiar slight ache in your forearms, not an exhaustion born of sudden strain, but the deep, settled fatigue of sustained, methodical labor. Your hands, which have spent hours tracing arcs and curves into the cold earth, are dusted with fine white slip, cool against your skin. The scent of wet clay remains close to you, a mineral, loamy smell that seems inseparable from this space, the smell of creation itself. Before the deep, steady work of firing, however, there is always this waiting time, this essential period of drying. The finished pieces, still glistening faintly with moisture, are carried slowly toward the designated drying area outside the workshop entrance. This space, set against the rough-hewn wall and shaded by a canopy of grapevines, feels marginally cooler than the contained heat of your labor bench. You begin the quiet process of arranging them, the vessels from today's throwing, waiting to shed their wet state into stability. You arrange them with practiced economy, building low, stable pyramids of terracotta. The lamps rest here among others of similar narrow form. The deep water jars are grouped together, and the wide oil storage amphorae find their respective corner plots. Each piece must have room around it, a small air pocket to allow the slow ingress of dry air, preventing any sudden pockets of trapped moisture that could cause cracking or warping in the hours to come. The arrangement is not merely aesthetic. It is governed by physics and patience. You remember how easily the materials fail when drying unevenly. A piece exposed too quickly to a sudden draft might contract too rapidly at one point, causing a hairline fracture across its curvature. Conversely, stacking wet whereas too tightly traps humidity, allowing mold or differential warping to take root deep within the material structure. You carefully position each new curve and straight edge, ensuring that no piece is resting on another in a way that could exert undue pressure as the damp clay begins its subtle, slow shrinkage. You run your fingers across the cool, receptive surfaces of the vessels. The feel is slightly yielding, less rigid than when you first pulled them from the wet slurry, but still possessing a fragile potential. The air here holds the unique blend of smells, the earthy scent of damp soil mixed with the sweeter, sharper note of dried herbs hung on ropes overhead. As the afternoon progresses, you find yourself pausing often, not out of idleness, but simply to observe the micro changes taking place across the stacked pottery. You watch how the sunlight shifts and angles through the semi-transparent dust motes dancing in the open space. The terracotta surfaces, still damp, absorb the light differently than wood or stone. They appear a deep, rich ochre, darkening near the base where they touch the earth and lightening to a pale biscuit tone on the exposed shoulders of the vessels. You notice the slight film forming on some surfaces, a mineral deposit drawn out by the slow evaporation process, glistening briefly before being absorbed into the pores of the clay itself. You walk slowly among the stacks, your gaze drifting over the rows, appreciating the subtle variation in form that speaks to human necessity. Here are lamps designed to hold precious olive oil and cast a necessary glow when the sun relinquishes its authority. There are wide basins meant to collect and store water drawn from cisterns. They speak of simple, persistent bodily need, and there are those large amphorae bearing the promise of distant trade routes, storage for goods that feed the life circulating through this vast, complex city. Every vessel, no matter how humble in appearance, is an anchor point for daily routine. The passage of time here is not marked by clocks or hurried announcements, but by changes in temperature and light intensity. You observe the shadows lengthening along the cobblestone path that runs alongside the drying racks. The heat generated during the peak hours of work slowly dissipates, replaced by a refreshing, deepening coolness. You think about the process itself, the transformation from pure liquid earth to durable, fired matter. Right now, it is suspended in the delicate state of near dryness. This waiting period demands respect. It is where the potter exercises patience more than skill. It is understanding that true craftsmanship does not reside only in the making, but equally and perhaps more profoundly in the ability to wait for the material itself to achieve its necessary state. When you next work with clay, it will have hardened further, losing the pliability of the wet slip, gaining a firmer texture. This gradual strengthening is critical. It allows the vessel to bear weight without immediate collapse and prepares it for the rigors of handling and, ultimately, the violent embrace of the kiln's heat. You occasionally gather your hands together, simply feeling the lingering dampness that reminds you of the cycle. The earth gave its form. Now, time itself must gently solidify that form through evaporation. It is a slow, breathing process, a gradual release of water molecules back into the atmosphere, leaving behind only the promise of solid, enduring utility. You gather your tools and take one final circuit around the stacks, straightening a fallen lamp, ensuring the edges remain clean and undisturbed by errant debris. A sense of quiet satisfaction settles over you. Today's bounty has been safely placed in time's hands, ready for the culmination of fire. Cool air of mid-morning still clings to you, scented faintly with the damp chalk dust and wet plaster from the early hours. As you move away from the quiet solitude of the drying racks and step into the main thoroughfare that services your quarter, the subtle shifts in the city's rhythm become immediately apparent. The slow hush of dawn is being replaced by a layered tapestry of activity, each sound a distinct thread woven through the persistent hum of human existence. You walk slowly, letting the sensory influx wash over you, not rushing to rejoin the purposeful flow of your own craft. Your bare feet press against the uneven surface of the cobblestones, which still retain the morning chill despite the lifting sun, and you notice how the stones absorb and redistribute warmth across the width of the street, creating pockets of varying temperature underfoot. You pass through a narrow passage between two buildings. The close quarters here amplify the scents. There is the sharp, pungent tang of stale wine mingled with goat manure, undercut by something sweetly yeasty, the smell of bread baking nearby. These competing odors form the distinct, unavoidable perfume of life lived densely together in the city. You observe how these smells accumulate and shift with your passage, a living testament to all the necessary functions that occur within arm's reach. The first signs of deep commerce appear as you draw closer to the central intersection, an area where the pathways widen and the activity levels increase exponentially. Ahead, a small smithy glows with restrained urgency. The metalworker is setting up his forge coals, coaxing a fragile orange light from the deep soot. You pause momentarily to let your eyes adjust to this contrast of muted stone gray and blazing industrial orange. The air near him feels subtly different, carrying the sharp metallic scent of heated iron mixed with coal smoke, a smell that speaks purely of necessary transformation. You continue walking, drawn by the steady thrumming sound emanating from a nearby stall. This is likely the tanner. You can smell the heavy earthiness and chemicals associated with curing hides, a powerful aroma that seems to cling to everything in its vicinity, mixing strangely with the fainter scent of grease and olive oil that always accompanies your trade. By the time you reach the main market thoroughfare, the scene is no longer just one sensory input, but an overwhelming layering. The sun, now higher, casts sharp geometries of light and shadow onto the dusty ground. You find yourself walking into a steady current of people, merchants carrying burdens on their shoulders or strapped to oxen, laborers moving with focused intent, and citizens simply traversing the necessary routes of daily life. You become acutely aware of your own quietness amidst this vibrant flow, marked only by the occasional slip of wet clay dust from your robes. Near a stall piled high with root vegetables, you encounter an elderly woman whose basket overflows with freshly gathered greens. She moves slowly, carefully arranging the leafy abundance to maximize visibility for passing customers. You notice the way she balances the weight, her movements economical and practiced. It is in these small, repetitive actions that the deep structure of Roman necessity becomes most visible, the constant need to trade goods acquired from every corner of a sprawling empire. You move past the grain merchant's stall. The grain seller has woven his bounty into towering, conical piles: wheat, spelt, and barley. These are grains meant for life, for bread that sustains both physical bodies and social structures. You watch as a wealthy citizen pauses to sample some spilled kernels, their dry weight contrasting sharply with the damp fluidity of your work. Further along, the scent changes again, becoming rich and oily. Here is where you encounter the local purveyor of olive oil, which is essential for everything: cooking, lighting, and skincare. You observe the careful pouring from large amphorae, watching the viscous liquid catch the light, a golden green reflectivity against the dusty background. The merchants here are accustomed to handling substantial amounts of commodity, their movements implying established trust and rigorous accounting. As you drift through this vibrant exchange, your thoughts inevitably turn back to the materials that define your own commerce. You see a corner cart piled high with salvaged terracotta fragments, broken lamps, and discarded storage bits. It is a visual reminder of entropy, of useful objects reaching their end before returning to raw material. Yet, even in the detritus, there is potential. Some pieces, you note, still hold the perfect curve, hinting at the skilled hand that once formed them. You find yourself lingering near a spice merchant whose wares, paprika, cumin, black peppercorns, are piled into fragrant pyramids of color. The intensity of their scent, dry and exotic, momentarily overwhelms the more grounded smells of earth and oil. You realize that even the most simple act, like mixing slip and shaping a modest jar, is predicated on an intricate global web of trade, of distant cultivation and careful movement. The midday sun intensifies its presence, baking away the lingering coolness and lending a hard, bright edge to all surfaces. The sounds coalesce into a powerful symphony, the rhythmic clanging of the smith's hammer providing a deep punctuation mark, the cheerful calls of vendors advertising their goods, the steady murmuring undertone of hundreds of conversations conducted in Latin or Greek variations. This is the pulse of the city at its peak, full and demanding. You realize that your craft, humble though it may seem against this backdrop of commerce and power, is deeply intertwined with the very fabric of this commotion. Every oil lamp sold here will shed light on a dinner table. Every storage jar will keep grain from spoiling. Every basin will collect water vital for life. The necessary function dictates the form, and that necessity anchors you firmly within the city's economic lifeblood. Passing by a group, exchanging coinage, the metallic weight of the coins clinking against leather pouches, you absorb the steady rhythm of transactional exchange. It is not merely the movement of money, but the measurable transfer of utility, goods exchanged for value, which in turn sustains your ability to draw breath and continue turning that wooden wheel. You feel a profound sense of material connection, recognizing how intimately connected the clay under your fingertips is to the distant harvest, the local forge, and the bustling heart of this market. The walk slows as you near your own workshop area again. The cacophony has not lessened, but it seems to modulate around your usual quadrant. You pull yourself gently from the flow of passing humanity, letting the peripheral details, the careful stacking of amphorae awaiting sale, the dust settling on a stack of dry lamps, guide your focus back inward. The noise remains a presence, a low, ambient roar that underlines everything you do here. It is the soundscape of survival and civilization. As the relentless energy of midday starts its slight, inevitable dip towards the late afternoon peak, you turn your gaze upon the row of carefully stacked, still damp wares, the perfect curve of an oil lamp, the robust shoulder of a water jar. These objects, awaiting their transformation by fire, rest quietly against the backdrop of humanity's endless, necessary motion. They are prepared to join the community, fulfilling their predetermined roles in the cycle of Roman existence. The deep, waning light of the late afternoon presses against the open entrance of the workshop. You carry a sense of physical fatigue that settles in your bones, a deep ache that is not quite exhaustion, but rather the steady weight of sustained effort. The day's rhythm has been a controlled escalation, from the cool dampness of the earth to the focused heat of shaping, through the humid thickness of the midday marketplace. Now, everything slows down again, settling into the necessary preparation for what must come next, the fire. You approach the kiln shed. It is a different space than the workshop, more utilitarian and raw. The air here holds a distinct perfume, a mixture of mineral dust, spent smoke, and banked ash that clings lightly to your tunic. You observe the structure itself, thick brick walls built against the persistent heat, a massive, gaping maw where the fire will eventually breathe out its collected violence. The first task is simply organization. You begin gathering the finished pieces, the pots waiting for their final transformation. They are stacked now in orderly piles of various sizes and colors, having completed their slow drying on the earth platform. Some are still dusted with fine white slip, others bear a slight reddish patina from contact with wet soil during handling. You do not hurry these movements. Each vessel is lifted by its base, balancing the delicate curve of a water jar or the straight necessity of an oil lamp. You note the weight of them in your palms, terracotta objects that feel surprisingly substantial, yet fundamentally brittle. They are necessary vessels. Nothing here is purely decorative. Walking among the stacks forces you into a deep awareness of form and function, even now, when the purpose has been entirely fulfilled by time and air. The lamp, with its small pouring spout, remains inherently poised for light. The wide storage jar holds memory, the residue of months' trade in olive oil. The simple basin speaks of cleansing and ritual. You carefully move these goods toward the kiln loading area. The ground beneath your feet is gritty, a mixture of packed clay dust and scattered embers from previous firings. You spend time arranging them on sturdy wooden pallets that must bear the weight and the unpredictable expansion of heat. It is not merely about stacking. It is an act of careful engineering. You inspect each piece closely, a methodical assessment against the knowledge gained through years of flawed success and fortunate survival. Are there any hairline fractures? Any spots where the slip has been too thick or too thin to fully harden? You run your fingertips over the shoulders of a large water pithos, feeling for irregularities that might have developed during the final stages of drying. A small nick, hidden from casual sight, is an invitation for catastrophe when the kiln breathes. This detailed inspection requires you to slow your breathing, to quiet the constant background hum of the city, and focus solely on the matter in your hands. You think about the inherent tension within these forms, the fact that they are meant to contain things, liquids, oil, light, stored wealth, yet they themselves must be profoundly stable. They rely on their own structure and integrity. Next, you begin the precise process of loading the chamber itself. The kiln interior is vast and shadowed, smelling strongly of burnt lime and deep ash. You retrieve refractory bricks used for lining the hearth. These are heavy blocks, porous and heat resistant, meant to protect the underlying fire brick structure from the worst assault of sustained temperatures. You arrange these foundational layers with measured care. The bricks must be set at specific angles and pressures to ensure that the radiating heat will distribute evenly across the entire load. A weak foundation here means uneven burning, leading to stresses and inevitable cracks in your finished wares. The arrangement is a silent conversation between materials, the strength of the engineered brick against the delicate promise held by the clay pots waiting above it. You visualize the process that is about to happen, the slow escalation from banked embers to intense heat through chemical change into hard permanence. It is a demanding choreography. You must account for spacing too. The vessels cannot simply be piled. They must be given room to breathe, both literally and thermally. If pots are pressed too closely together, the gases of combustion will have nowhere to escape until critical pressure builds up, potentially rupturing the surrounding ceramic. You lift a lamp, then gently nestle it into place on a brick pedestal, ensuring a finger's width gap remains around its circumference. The air is growing cooler now as dusk pulls the color from the sky, and you feel the subtle dampness of the approaching evening cool against your skin. This transitional light forces you to rely more on touch and smell than sight. You become attuned to the scents, the mineral tang rising from the wet dust, the sharper scent of charring wood that will soon fuel the beast of fire. The sheer volume of objects requires a monumental patience. It is not merely pottery. It is an inventory of necessary life functions for a quarter of the city. Every lamp, every jar, every basin contributes to the continuation of daily ritual, the lighting of a room after sunset, the cooling of water in summer heat, the preservation of grain. You methodically stack the final sections. You intersperse some larger pithoi with smaller cooking vessels, ensuring that no single type of material dominates any localized area of the firing chamber. This careful balance is essential for managing thermal shock across such a varied load. The physical exertion of lifting and positioning these hundreds of objects settles into a steady rhythm. It is mindful labor, each movement an extension of accumulated knowledge about physics, chemistry, and the temperament of fired earth. Finally, all the wares are arrayed in their temporary cradle, secured by stacked bricks, supported on dry pallets, waiting within the vast, hollow shell of the kiln. The process slows to a near halt. You take a step back from the immense loading area, surveying your work against the backdrop of the cooling twilight. You observe the geometry of the setup, the structured chaos of necessity. This accumulation of simple terracotta forms represents not just goods for sale, but the tangible support system for life in this densely packed Roman city. Plumbing water, keeping light, and storing sustenance until the next harvest. The cool evening air presses against your back, a profound contrast to the imagined furnace within. You realize that all the accumulated heat of the day's work, the sweat, the rhythmic grinding on the wheel, the constant physical effort, will now be contained by this structure, condensed into fire. You reach for the stack of kindling and seasoned hardwood that await your attention. The preparation is complete. You have presented the perfect load to the coming heat. Now begins the hardest part, coaxing life back into stone through controlled combustion. A profound sense of quiet expectancy settles over you, a calm acceptance of the necessary transition from damp earth to hardened permanence. The air inside the communal space is already heavy, thick, with a unique combination of dust and residual heat. It hangs close to your skin, smelling faintly mineral, like baked bone mixed with old smoke. You stand before the massive kiln structure, built from rough-hewn brick and refractory mortar, feeling the coolness emanating from its sides despite the recent roaring. The work is done for now. The initial fire has peaked and begun its long, slow descent toward a manageable warmth. You approach your designated area of stored goods, the carefully stacked wares awaiting transformation. They are damp still, clinging to the memory of the wet slip that shaped them mere hours ago. You run your fingers lightly over the curved shoulder of a large storage jar, feeling the minute imperfections in the clay that speak only of human hands and the raw earth. These objects, holding everything from spilled oil to precious water stores for the community, have been made durable by fire, but they require this final stage of waiting, of slow cooling. The task now is to maintain the vigil, an act less dramatic than the roaring flame itself, yet one that demands a profound focus. You adjust yourself within the periphery of the operation, your senses widening to encompass the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The light outside has begun its gradual ascent, bleeding a pale orange into the deep blue of the dawn sky. This external illumination contrasts sharply with the smoky gloom inside the workshop, creating pockets of shadow and warmth. You move slowly around the perimeter of the kiln. There is nothing immediate to do but to listen. The sounds here are often deceptive. The soft drip of condensation from a high brick corner, the faint, rhythmic shift of settling earth within the structure, the sighing groan of cooling metal supports. Each sound seems amplified in the cavernous space, drawing your attention inward towards the necessary quietude. You dip your hand into a basin of water brought specifically for this purpose. The water is surprisingly tepid, far from cold, yet cool enough to offer relief against the ingrained grit under your nails. You breathe it deeply, inhaling not just the wet smell, but also the faint underlying scent of burnt limestone and carbonized fuel, the perfume of transformation. Thinking about these vessels, you consider their immediate purpose in the city that awaits them. They will hold scented oil for nightly lamps, cool spring water from a public fountain, or perhaps grain awaiting milling. Each form is predicated entirely on function, reflecting the unwavering rhythm of Roman necessity. They are not art, though they possess an undeniable grace. They are infrastructure made tangible. The initial fierce heat has hardened all things and all boundaries. The intense chemical drama played out over many hours cannot be reversed quickly. You understand that to rush this cooling process is to invite disaster. Thermal shock, leading to the catastrophic fracture of the delicate, hard-fired surfaces. Everything must proceed at nature's pace, a lesson written in stone and fired clay. Your movements become economical, almost meditative. You check the stack of lamps again, noting how their openings, the small mouth designed for a wick, are uniform. They are arranged upright on wooden pallets, preventing contact with each other that might lead to uneven heat retention. The spacing is crucial. Even minor variance in distance can concentrate stress points. You pause near a pile of discarded offcuts, lumps of clay or broken rims from pieces that failed the test or were altered during trimming. You examine them not for their worth, but as physical records. They are proof of error, of resistance, and of materials pushed to their limit. There is a quiet dignity in the rejection. Even failure contains knowledge about the limits of the earth. The gradual descent from extreme heat brings with it subtle changes in temperature you learn to feel before you perceive. You press your fingertips lightly against a large pithos jar. The warmth that transfers back is not the sharp sting of active fire, but a deep, residual measure of thermal memory, a sustained, grounding heat. You shift your attention from touch to smell. As the internal atmosphere continues to equalize and cool, different volatile compounds are released by the fired material itself. There is now a less acrid scent than when you stoked the flames. Instead, there is a clean, almost metallic smell of mineral salts, confirming that the glaze-like vitrification process has successfully taken place within the clay body. This subtle shift in olfactory detail signals the turning point, the quiet truce between creation and permanence. The night vigil transitions into an extended period of careful observation. You settle yourself into a rhythm of steady vigilance, allowing your consciousness to slow down alongside the cooling cycle. The air grows thicker with dew-like moisture drawn up from the street by the surrounding structures. You feel the coolness creep back into your exposed skin, contrasting sharply with the lasting warmth retained deep within the core of the massive bricks. This contrast is the physical representation of time itself, a steady giving way to a more temperate state. You reflect on the cycle, the wet earth gathered at dawn, molded by muscle and water, shaped by intuition upon the wheel, hardened into purposeful forms, then entrusted entirely to the consuming power of fire. Your involvement shifts from active creation to careful guardianship. You are now an observer of material science, a caretaker of transition. The hours draw long, marked only by the gentle lightening of the overall light and the steadying temperature of the air. Your awareness becomes attuned not to sudden events, but to sustained conditions, the slow drip rate from a joint, the predictable pattern of condensation forming on cooler surfaces, the steady diminishing quality of the residual furnace glow. You realize that this cooling period is perhaps the most humbling part of the entire process. The roaring fire was raw power. The initial wet clay was pliable potential. But the quiet wait for cool stability, this requires patience and trust in an invisible, slow-moving thermodynamic process. You are participating in a geological timescale, merely standing as witness to material becoming rock-like permanence. The scent of damp dust begins to reassert itself, mingling with the mineral heat. The aromas of wet city refuse and baking earth become more pronounced now that the intensity of smoke has waned. This grounding smell connects you back to the immediate reality of the place, anchoring the magnificent achievement of the kiln to the pedestrian, ongoing needs of the street outside. You finally rest near the kiln's entrance, pulling your shawl tighter against the cooling drafts, surveying the amassed bounty of sturdy terracotta, ready to support the flow of life through a thriving Roman city. The profound satisfaction is not in the act of molding, but in successfully guiding the earth through its necessary rebirth. The deep red glow of the kiln finally begins to soften. You stand back, your muscles protesting the long hours of heat and effort, watching the residual colors shift from blinding orange to a dull, velvety crimson. The air is thick now, cooled by sheer volume, carrying the clean, mineral scent of spent fire, a smell entirely unlike the damp earth or smoking wood you started with. You let out a slow breath that feels more like a release than an intake, sinking slightly onto your heels as you take in the spectacle of cooled, transformed permanence. The exhaustion is deep and soothing, settling into the marrow of your bones. Around you, stacked neatly on the cooling stone floor, are the goods, hundreds of silent witnesses to the day's work, now hard enough to withstand the slow seepage of time itself. You run a fingertip lightly over the curved shoulder of an oil lamp, feeling not the intense heat of minutes ago, but the dense coolness of rock that has endured millennia. The surface is flawless, slightly matte, bearing the faint signature of its own burning genesis, a perfect patina telling of fire's passage. How many mornings have you witnessed this transformation? How many cycles of damp earth to monumental permanence? You wonder about the life these vessels will now contain, the precious oil that illuminated a chamber in darkness, the deep water that quenched thirst, or the grain that fed an entire household for weeks. Each one is perfectly suited by its shape, reflecting not just human need, but the measured necessities of Roman existence. They stand like still monuments to domestic life, patiently awaiting their integration into a routine you do not live, yet entirely sustained through your labor. Your attention drifts from the perfect symmetry of a large water jar, whose wide mouth suggests capacity and permanence, to the tiny, delicate opening at the base of a lamp, so easily overlooked in its humble design. These objects speak volumes without needing to utter a single syllable. They are practical poetry, embodiments of function rendered durable by heat. You slowly circle the periphery of the cooling goods, taking inventory not merely for sale, but for contemplation, for understanding the weight of your necessary skill. The sheer volume is impressive. It speaks to the scale and sustaining power of the city outside, a distant hum that seems only possible because of this quiet accumulation of earthenware. Sometimes you consider how disposable things are, the fleeting nature of human life, and even the seasonal bounty stored within these pots. Yet, by mastering the clay, you have found a kind of permanence. The earth accepts your will, if guided by patience and precise knowledge. The thought settles in that the potter's magic is not in transmuting mud to gold. That requires greater alchemy, but in coaxing durability from the readily available elements. You notice dust motes dancing in the last shafts of waning sunlight, filtering through the high smoke vent, illuminating the countless tiny imperfections and perfect symmetries of the stack. This light catches the subtle glazes, the natural tones of the local earth mixed with kaolin slip. Each vessel has a unique character. No two pieces, even ones thrown from the same batch, possess the exact same minute grain or curve. You gently adjust one large pithos that seems slightly listing, aligning it with its neighbors, as if you are setting them into their rightful place within the urban tapestry. The air remains wonderfully cool now, carrying a faint mixture of burnt char and baked clay, an earthy perfume that becomes synonymous with enduring work. As your gaze traces the careful arrangement of goods, from massive storage vats to slender cosmetic jars, you appreciate the quiet dialogue between need and form. Every curve must serve, every lip must catch something, be it oil, water, or perhaps simply a cup of cool wine. It is an exacting kind of thoughtfulness that few people ever pause to consider when they simply open their doors in the evening. You feel a profound sense of deep rest settling over your limbs, not the wild exhaustion of sudden labor, but the steady ache of sustained effort. The day's rhythm has concluded its high note and entered this beautiful, cooling quiet. Your focus settles now on your hands, the ingrained grime beneath the nails, the slight callus forming along the knuckles from years of wedging and shaping. These hands, they are not merely tools, they are living records of necessity and mastery. They know the temperature gradient where the clay must be held to resist warping. They understand the exact amount of water needed to achieve optimum plasticity without compromising structure. You move slowly, purposefully, retrieving a damp sponge from a basin placed near your work area. The sponge feels pleasantly saturated, drawing across a piece of wood that still holds traces of slip. It is an act of cleanup, yes, but it is also a ritualistic wiping away of the day's residue, preparing yourself for what comes next, the simple reality of living alongside this necessary craft. You take one last look at the stacked, cool vessels. They are solid, they are ready, and while the heat has gone, the warmth of their utility remains, humming gently in the surrounding silence, promising order to a complicated world. The silent satisfaction is a profound thing, richer than any celebration, the quiet certainty that you have made things last, enough to keep the rhythm of an empire beating on its sturdy pottery vessels. Until tomorrow's dawn arrives once more, the air outside the kiln seems noticeably cooler now, a gradual release of heat into the late afternoon shadows. You stand back from the cooling mouth of the communal firing pit, brushing dust and fine ash from your rough tunic sleeves. The residual warmth clings to your skin, a ghost of the immense energy that has just been spent. You survey the organized stacks of finished wares, the sturdy water jars, the delicate lamp bases, broad basin ready for cleansing, each piece bearing the unmistakable evidence of necessary labor. are inert now, cooled by the descending twilight, solid proof of hours measured not in clocks, but in breaths drawn and managed fire. Your attention naturally falls to your tools scattered across the dirt floor near the workshop entrance. There is the heavy iron scraper, blackened from soot, resting against the corner post, the wooden palette knife, its wood fibers gritty with dried slip, the simple bundle of reeds used for scraping damp clay scraps into storage. Each object tells a silent story of effort. You lift the scraper by the handle, noting the satisfying weight in your hand, a heft that speaks to decades of use and necessary maintenance. The dust underfoot is a complex mixture: settled ash from the kiln's exhaust, fine reddish particles of fired clay mixed with natural earth, silt kicked up during the day's strenuous activities. You do not sweep it into neat piles. Instead, you merely walk across it, your sandals displacing small clouds of grit that hang briefly in the fading light before settling again. This accumulation of debris is simply the signature of the day's work, a physical record of necessity. The process of cleaning up begins slowly, mirroring the quiet descent of the sun behind the city walls. You gather the waste scraps of clay, the offcuts, the rejected edges from the finished pieces, and use a broad hand shovel to sweep them into a designated corner pile, away from the structural supports and pathways. The wetness has long since evaporated from these remnants, leaving behind brittle, dull lumps that crumble slightly at your touch. You consider how much of this material, so recently fluid and workable in your hands, will soon revert entirely to inert mineral dust. You move towards a low wooden trough set aside for the soaking of tools and scraps. The water is not clean river water, but heavily brackish, carrying minute traces of lime from the kiln residue and the metallic scent of spent charcoal. You methodically dip the scraper first, feeling the cool shock against your fingertips before plunging the bundle of reeds into the liquid. There is a sense of ritual in this cleansing, washing away not just the dirt, but the tactile memory of the day's physical effort, the ingrained dampness on your palms, the fine layer of clay dust under your fingernails. The water drips from your hands and tools. Each drop seems to carry the weight of accumulated hours. You scrape the residue off the wooden paddle with a wet rag, noting how the deep grain of the olive wood absorbs the moisture unevenly, darkening in patches. These small actions, the dipping, the wiping, the stacking of soaked implements, are repetitive acts of closure. They signal the end of engagement with the primary task, moving from the transformative chaos of fire to quiet order. You observe the light shifting across the stacked vessels as your cleanup proceeds. The setting sun catches the smooth, curved surfaces of the storage jars, making them momentarily glow a deep terracotta red that seems more vibrant than any color in nature. This brief illumination reveals imperfections: a slight wobble on a handle, a hairline fracture that might have survived the kiln but deserves noting, a tiny ripple from the wet slip when it was still soft. These vessels are not objects of art, they are calculated instruments. They must perform a function to hold oil for light, to store water for life, to cup grain for sustenance. Your mind drifts through these necessities, understanding that your skill is measured by durability and utility, rather than by visual flair. A broken vessel means an immediate, tangible disruption in someone's household routine. It means darkness, or thirst, or emptiness. After the tools are rinsed and left to drip into their designated spots, you take a final walk through the perimeter of your workshop area. The air smells different now, less aggressive smoke, more diffused sense of drying earth, mingled with the faint, sweet tang of wood smoke that has had time to dissipate fully into the cooling dusk. You find the corner where you used the clay scrap pile earlier. The scent of damp, mixed minerals is strongest here. Kneeling down briefly, you run your hands over a patch of untouched ground. The earth beneath your fingers is cooler than the objects in the stacks, absorbing the evening chill. It feels profoundly different from the engineered strength of the fired ware's soft, yielding, and utterly raw. This contrast between the malleable potential of wet mud and the lasting permanence of fire-hardened clay is a constant meditation for you. The earth is patient in its infinite cycles, providing material without fail. Yet it demands highly specialized human intervention to be transformed into something enduring. You are the conduit between nature's bounty and the needs of an immense civilization. You finish by gathering your own small implements, your ledger slate, charcoal stylus, and a simple coil of rope used for securing future shipments. Everything is accounted for, ordered, and placed where it belongs. The physical act of organizing concludes the labor of the day with profound efficiency. You sweep the last noticeable fragments of grit into a bundle, holding them up briefly, the residue of effort, before casting the small pile away from the workshop area. The rhythm slows to a near halt. The distant sounds of commerce are fading. The shouts and clatter that characterized midday have been replaced by the softer cadence of evening. A donkey's muffled braying, the quiet sweep of feet on stone, the low chatter of voices drifting down an alleyway. You slip your worn outer tunic back over your working clothes. The movement is slow, unhurried, carrying the satisfying weight of completion. As you walk away from the glowing stack of finished pottery and past the sleeping silhouette of the kiln, you feel the day's work settle into a deep, abiding peace. It is not the dramatic quiet of abandonment, but the restful silence of necessary sustenance.